Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We would love, as we get started, for you to pop in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from this afternoon. And welcome. My name is Emily Bell, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Coming to Terms with Plant Names. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through our education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sales and renewals of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. You can see our old design there and our new plate that's been on the road for a number of years now. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower License Plate. And if you purchase or have the plate, you're eligible for a membership. So just let us know you have the tag and we'll get you set up in the database. Be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, for upcoming events, and tons more. We're also on social media, and you can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar, we're having a brief break from the Botany and Context series with Dr. Folsom as he goes on vacation. So we have a wonderful presentation, Creating a Colorful Native World Inside an HOA. This presentation will focus on harnessing native plant seasonality to meet HOA landscaping demands, among other things. And then in April, we'll be back with Dr. Folsom for the continuation of this series and picking up with getting familiar with plant families. And you definitely won't want to miss that. Also, stay tuned for many great field trips we've got coming up. Our next field trip is this Saturday on February 22nd. You can join me for a lovely leisurely hike at Haw Creek Preserve in Flagler County. We're going to see some mayhaw, hopefully springing into bloom, as well as Walter's viburnum, and enjoy scenic overlooks of the creek and explore that bottomland woods there. And there's still time to sign up for that. Our March field trips are pretty exciting. We're going to be at Old Mayaca Preserve in Sarasota County on March 22nd, and we'll be in Blackwater River State Forest in Okaloosa County on March 29th. Be sure to follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, or check out flawildflowers.org/events to stay abreast of our webinar and field trip opportunities. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. The chat is active, but we do not monitor it for questions. So you've got to use that Q&A feature, and we'll address questions at the end of the talk as time permits. If your question isn't answered, you can email it to info@flawildflowers.org. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel in about 24 to 48 hours. When it's available, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, along with a resource page and additional links. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jim Folsom. His lifelong love of plants is reflected in a BS in botany from Auburn University, an MA in biology from Vanderbilt University, and a PhD in research botany from the University of Texas at Austin. Though his research has centered largely on the orchid family, with much of that time spent in tropical America, Jim's botanical interests are wide-ranging. For 35 years before his retirement in 2021, as curator and director of the Botanical Gardens at the Huntington in San Marino, California, he dedicated much of his effort to educational programs that increase public interest and understanding of the science, culture, and history of plants and gardens. These topics are also reflected in his website, botanyandcontext.com, and on his TikTok channel, Botany and Context. He lives now on St. George Island in Florida with his wife, Deborah, who's also a botanist, and they have 2 children, Molly and James. Jim is also currently serving as an incoming member of the board of the American Horticultural Society. So with that, give us a brief moment and we will get Jim's presentation up.
Okay, let's see if we can, let me see now, desktop. Wait, I gotta go. Oh, I gotta hit share. Go. Now I gotta find my darn desktop again. Went away. Keynote.
Gotcha.
Yeah, let's go. You know what? We left it. We left it back. You and I left it with we were looking at it. So let's start at the beginning instead of somewhere in the middle. So coming to terms with plant names, this is our third lecture and our discussion, and there's a lot to cover. I've posted more of the detail on the website, and we're just going to breeze over some of these things. But when you think about plant names, I think about binomials, other people think about common names. But plant names are, naming plants is like naming cats. It's a deep, somewhat inscrutable process, but it's singular because in the botanical world, a plant only has one name. And that one name only applies to one species of plant. So it's a very singular process. Names are important in society. Confucius tells us the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. What the superior person requires is just, I'm going to move this on, is just that in their words there be nothing incorrect. You wouldn't be surprised, therefore, that in China, they've been naming plants for a long time. Here's a really cool example. Back in 1220, Wang Jie posted or on a scroll. This was one of like 80 different block prints, and this one was pharmaceutical. So this plant has a pharmaceutical name, Ying Shi, which means star fruit, and it has a common name, which is Qiang Wei, which is wall rose, Wei being the word for rose. In English, the common name is multiflora rose. Some of you might know that this has become a problematic invasive in the Northeast. And of course, around the world, not just in the US, but in China and in all languages, the Latin version of the binomial Rosa multiflora is the official name for this plant. The Chinese have much older texts. The first century, there's a scroll that has 365 named plants. The literary expositor in the 4th century, we see a listing of 251. The Imperial Encyclopedia, about 1000 AD or CE, had 580 plants. Of course, the big kahuna is the Binchao Gongmu, which is a Chinese material medica, huge document. And in that, there are like almost 1,100 entries related to plants alone. Here's a beautiful drawing from one of the later editions of that, which is Zhonghuang, which translates as yellow ginger. We call it turmeric, but its scientific name is Curcuma longa. Now, in the Western world, we also have a tradition of naming things, and it goes back to Genesis. The good Lord made all the beasts and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever he called them, that was what their name was. Now, it didn't work out so well for plants. The good Lord never got around to asking Adam to name all the plants. Satan intervened, and Adam and Eve were tossed out of Eden. And so I guess that's why some people think today that plant names are the work of the devil. They can be quite complex. That same book, the Bible, was the driving force behind Gutenberg's technology for movable type. And the first thing he printed, of course, was the Bible because it was something that was in great demand. He printed his version in about 180 of them. A lot of them still exist. The Huntington here has a copy on vellum, which is skin. But his process became just a dynamic force in the reinvention of Western culture, such that in the first 50 years after Gutenberg introduced the Bible using his press, that system made it everywhere. And estimates are that there were 10 million books printed in the incunable period, the first 50 years after Gutenberg introduced the press. That meant the ancient knowledge in the Western world suddenly was much more current. Texts that had just existed in rare manuscripts like Theophrastus suddenly were available in thousands of copies. And so we think of Theophrastus as the father of botany because he named and talked about 500 different plants. Back as early, we think, as 300 BC. Nothing original exists of this. It's all in a few manuscripts. Some of them only exist because they went into Arabian translation and were brought back into Greek and Latin, finally printed after Gutenberg. But a book that, and oh, by the way, so Theophrastus looks very noble here. Look how classical he is. Here's a good looking picture of made up picture, of course, of Theophrastus. I love the fact that in the Nuremberg Codex, the Chronicles in 1493, he has a lot quainter look, kind of like an herbalist. The big book that our text that survived even during the Dark Ages as being available and important was Dioscorides' Materia Medica, written, we think, around 60 AD, 60 CE or 60 AD. Here's a beautiful printed version, but in that first 50 years, there were two copies, two different versions of Dioscorides that were translated back into Latin and were published. That had reigned as the only Western source of information about herbal medicine for 1,500 years and continued for 200 or 300 more. It became the basis for a whole industry of turning out herbals. Otto Brunfels was one of the earliest. He and Fuchs and Bach were three different German physicians who put out their own books based on the text from Dioscorides. But suddenly, Dioscorides plants were all in the Mediterranean. Here we are in Northern Europe, and we're having to evolve the text to match the plants that exist. So here's a very, let's see, he calls it Images of Living Herbs in Imitation of Nature, Herbarium Vivi Iconis. So, and he included lovely drawings, which was a new invention. Nobody had been putting drawings from nature in herbals, so that became the standard. Herbals just exploded. Dioscorides, translated and used by various authors, became the most popular book, printed book after the Bible. So it was everywhere in the hands of physicians and herbalists. But botany was beginning to consolidate. So we're in a period called the Scientific Revolution now. And by 1583, Andreas Cesalpino, if you know the genus Cesalpinia, it's named for him, he did what is considered the first textbook of botany, De Plantis Libri 16. And suddenly, he's talking about 1,520 plants. He has the names of that many different plants just in 1583. The growth of knowledge about plants and science has moved now from just the Italian Greek area up into Northern and Western Europe. And by 1620, we have some important statements. Francis Bacon, in a book called Novum Organum, is laying out the details for how people should conduct experiments and draw knowledge through collecting data. We have Robert Boyle, the British chemist, and by 1666, Isaac Newton is writing optics and publishing his discoveries. A guy named Robert Hooke, is publishing the first real book on microscopic images, and philosophy has shifted to the philosophies expressed by John Locke and people after him on how people understand things. But at the same time period as this is happening in England, things are happening all over Europe. This is a famous pair of brothers, both surgeons, and their father was a surgeon, Johann and Caspar Bowen. These are the Bowen brothers, and Linnaeus accepted the name of the genus Bowinia, which is the legume, for them, and it was named because it's a leaf that's emarginated. It has these two lobes. And so I think that's kind of clever. The genus Bauhinia named for the two brothers. But anyway, Caspar turned out a remarkable work. So in 1623, Caspar finally published his life's work, which is the Pinax. Pinax, that's what that in Greek, that's Pinax, Theatri Botanici. And you can see the translation here, the names of about 6,000 plants. So now suddenly the herbalists have created lists of plants and described new plants, and there are 6,000 named and known plants. And he creates this concordance basically with their synonyms and differences, methodically proposing them according to their genera and species. So now we're hearing these terms, genera and species. And that gets stronger when we get to texts about plants starting to show up, not just in Latin, but in vernacular languages. So here's a very important botanist, Tournefort, and the king's botanist in France. And he puts out a really modern seeming book that covers 7,000 species, but he was beat out by an Englishman, John Ray, who published a 3-volume set over what, almost 10 years, called Historia Plantarum, outlining information on 18,000 species. Now, his concept of species might be very different from ours. So I don't know how many true species are involved, but it's a history of plants comprising the species hitherto published and many others newly discovered and described, in which the first thing to be discussed is the plants in general, and then all the genera, and then the greatest to the least, down to the most detailed species. Well, he did that. Let's look at a plant, one of our wildflowers, as known and understood by John Ray at the turn of the 1700s. We call this Platanthus ciliaris today. John Ray called it Orchis Marilandica grandis procera floribus luteus, That is the name that he used for the plant. If it were an earlier known plant, it might have just been one or two words, Orchis or Orchis vulgare, but that was the name. These are called polynomials. So before Linnaeus' Species Plantarum, scientists, scholars, most of whom were medical doctors, used these long names. That's not just, that is the name of the plant. There's yet a description. So here's a translation of Ray's description of Platanthus ciliaris. The stem is tall, firm. You can read this on the website, but I'm just doing this to show you two things. One, you can go into Google Translate and type all this stuff, and you don't have to know Latin. You can you can really learn a lot from these ancient books by using that. But secondly, the name is complex. Now let's go and see what happened next. So here's Ray, 1700, Tournefort, 1623, which is, by the way, the same year that the first folio of Shakespeare was published, 1623. So we have Bowen, and then Tournefort, and then Ray, and a bunch of other people that were getting plants, not just from Europe, but now plants coming in from the New World. And here comes this guy named Carl Linnaeus, who clearly has a photographic memory. I mean, everything he ever read and saw, he remembers, because he knows all the literature down to the last comma. And in Species Plantarum, 1753, here's his treatment of orchids. Here's the plant we call Platanthus ciliaris, Orchis, and that is the name. 1741, Linnaeus wrote the first book on orchids, and this is the name he used for that plant. It was known already from dried specimens in Europe, dried specimens collected in Virginia and Maryland. And here it is with a long lip with lanciated ciliate lanceolations on it. Here's what his friend Van Rooyen called it, and what he and Gronovius called it in Flora Virginica, Orchis nectare labio lanceolata ciliata, the orchis with a long nectary and a lip that has long ciliations. It was called by Morrison in his history, Orchis palmata, but here's that very name we saw, Orchis marilandica grandis and procera. That is Ray's supplement, page 58. So that refers directly to the page we were just looking at. The critical thing Linnaeus did for the 6,000 species in the 2-volume book, Species Plantarum, is he added this word in the margin. And so we have adopted what he called his trivial name, the genus Orchis, and the trivial name, which we now call the specific epithet, Ciliaris. So that simplification of all of this garbage, all of these long polynomials, changed the world and was adopted practically overnight. I mean, by the turn of the century, hardly anybody was still using the ancient system of naming plants. And and he didn't just do this for plants, he did it for animals. Now, Linnaeus thought he was writing a flora of the world, and he figured maybe with 12,000 plants, we would have the world's flora. He was way off. Here in the second half of the 1800s, between 1865 and 1883, we have George Bentham and Joseph Dalton Hooker of Kew writing Genera Plantarum. In the end, they came up with around 97,200 species in the world flora. It was not a world flora, but that's what they came up with. They were followed very closely by a famous work, Engler and Prontel's, De Naturalikum Pflanzen Familien, and they also came up with almost 100,000 described plants species in this book with names, with good scientific names. Now, these people were operating without set rules. So today we have rules for how plants are named. And today you can go online, you can visit Plants of the World Online by Kew, and you can enter that, you can go and see the name and the history of names for every accepted plant species in the world. Or you can go to the World Flora Online, which is a newer product, and look at the evolving flora of plants across the world. And they now assume, as of last week, that there are around 378,000 accepted species of plants on Earth. But their database shows that they have 1.6 million names. So you can see there's a problem. We've got a lot more names available than we have species represented. We'll talk about that in a second. As much as things change, they don't really change much. Here is Bartlett in 1940, and everything he says is pretty modern. The concept of the genus must be as old as folk science. Basically, what he's telling us here is even in common everyday language, we have a habit of knowing one object and then naming others that are similar by just taking that name, like apple, love apple being a tomato, apple of the earth being a potato, taking something we know and naming something new to us based by comparison. And that's kind of what a genus is grouping plants that have something in common, and then the specific epithet points out what we consider different species. So I like this quote: changes that have come about since Linnaeus have been to define genera as groups of species that do not seem to violate the conceptions of natural affinity by descent. That is a very kind of old-fashioned way of saying what is very modern, and that is today the assumption is that if it's a good genus, every species in that group, that one genus, has a common ancestor. They have a common line of descent. So even though that was 1940, and we think we've got a modern way of looking at it today with cladistics and molecular taxonomy, those thoughts existed 100 years ago. Now let's come to Florida, because all of a sudden we've covered this kind of worldwide approach to the flora. Let's look at the plants of Florida, the wildflowers. Here's a really straightforward thing. Florida, first native settlement, assumed to be around 14,000 BP. The Spanish claimed they controlled it and owned it in 1513. There was a 2-decade period, when the British had ownership of Florida, which changed a lot, by the way. That was a huge, important period in the biological study of Florida. It was returned to Spain, and then after some contentious period, The U.S. gave Spain $5 million and took control of the whole territory in 1821, and by 1845, it's a state. By the time Florida was a state, more than half of the species that are part of our flora had already been named, and they weren't named from Florida. They were named from people studying the southeastern coastal plain up in Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and North Carolina. By 1824, Linnaeus is credited with over 600 species native to Florida, named from more from the East Coast, but native to Florida, that he described. Thomas Walter, who wrote in 1788, published Flora Caroliniana, he's credited with 130 species. Andre Michaud, you've heard of Michaud's Flora Borealis Americana, that's 1803. Michaud was a remarkable person, traveling all on his lonesome all over the eastern seaboard, and he's credited with 189 species. And then we have Stephen Elliott, a rich, wealthy plantation owner and cultured man, Yale graduate, living in Charleston, and he wrote a thing called I can't see it here. Let me see. The Sketch of Botany of South Carolina. And he is, in 1824 is responsible for 53 species. Let's look at a bigger list. So here are some of the most productive botanical authors. I went through that incredible resource, the ISB Atlas of Native Florida Plants, and I tallied up all of the, it's easy to do because they give you the whole database and you can look at the authors of different plants. And these are the major authors of plants in the Florida flora. And most of the plants we know were already described way before 1900. Names, and you'll know these names: Thomas Natal, Chapman, we'll get to him in a second, Eliot, a Swede who studied tropical plants, Schwartz, Lamarck, who came up with the concept of Lamarckism, French. He was Raffinesse, the crazy guy, Joaquin, all of these people. You'll run into these names when studying our flora. Let's look behind the curtains and see what regulates this today and what happened. The first botanist to really reside in Florida and contribute majorly in a national way to study of the Florida flora was indeed Alvin Wentworth Chapman, living in Apalachicola. Note this. I always see this picture and I think of him in his 80s living in a house that still exists in Apalachicola. But I've come now through this to think of him as a younger person. He moved to Florida in 1835. He was only 26 and he had already gotten somewhere. He went to Amherst for his undergraduate degree, but he had somehow in the intervening period studied enough medicine to be called a doctor. He moved to Quincy at age 26. By 1847, he was residing in Apalachicola. Now, Chapman was already out collecting plants at this young age. As soon as he came to Florida, he was out collecting plants. He was not yet describing them. By the time he turned 50, he now is publishing his own work, The Flora of the Southern United States, 1860, second edition, 1889, final edition right before he died, 1897. But his earlier material was sent to Asa Gray and John Torrey. Asa Gray working out of Harvard, Torrey out of Columbia. But I call this the Harvard crew because Asa Gray really grounded botany in the United States during that period. Asa Gray, as you note, is just 1 year younger than Chapman. So they're kind of compatriots. And Chapman thought of himself as actually writing the Southern companion piece to Gray's most famous work, which was the Manual of Northeastern Plants, the Manual of Botany based on Northeastern plants. The era of the Harvard era ends, and suddenly we have on the scene Nathaniel Lloyd Britton, another New Yorker, and we have the creation in 1895 of New York Botanical Garden. And these people totally own Florida now for the next 10 or 20 years. You might have seen many plants named Nashii. Those are named after George Valentine Nash, but he himself named many species in our flora, as did Britain. But the big kahuna here is John Kunkel Small. In 1903, just 4 years after Chapman's death, Small publishes his doctoral dissertation, which is over 1,000-page flora of the plants of the southeastern United States. And you think, well, how much difference did he make? Look at this. So the last in the appendix to the flora, there's 16 pages in which he notes what new genera and species are published in the flora. It was a massive undertaking, and it's the book I learned a lot. I use that book a lot, along with the North Carolina books, the Radfordalis and Bell. Those were the two books I used when I was a younger student learning the flora. And these reflect a lot of time spent in Florida. Small probably collected more extensively in Florida than anybody else. Those people were operating before there was an absolute international code of nomenclature. So the rules they followed were slightly different from the rules today. The first statement of an international code was a meeting in Europe in 1867, a publication called the Laws of Botanical Nomenclature, but the Americans did not especially subscribe to that. Only in 1935, with the Cambridge rules, was there a complete international agreement as to how plants are to be named. The most recent one is down here. I can't see it on my screen. Let me see. The most recent one would be the Shenzhen Code out of Beijing. An interesting one is the 2012 code from Melbourne, and that was where suddenly, instead of having to publish in a printed material of a certain type, you could actually publish new taxa online through PDF format. So every 5 to 10 years, the botanists from around the world meet and have an international agreement. They adjust the rules, and those are the rules. Let's look at what those rules do. Well, they're based on principles. So there's some principles. First principle: the rules of botanical nomenclature are not dependent on zoological or prokaryotic. They're separate. Plant names are based on nomenclatural types. Somewhere there is a physical specimen or a drawing that is considered the base representation of that plant name. Priority rules: the earliest valid name published for a plant is the name that has to be accepted, unless you go through the process of getting a vote to conserve some other name. There is only one correct name for a plant, and a name can only be used one time correctly. It may be used 100 times, but all of those are invalid. Well, they're valid, but they're unacceptable. And then all names are treated as Latin, and the rules are retroactive. So if a new rule is passed, unless exceptions are spelled out, that rule then impacts every name that has ever been accepted. Let's look at some more rules. They're just rules. The code covers algae, fungi, and plants. The principles that I just showed you are the basis for the code. The rules are set out in articles. The purpose of the rules is to put nomenclature in order. They deal with the rules include recommendations, which are not absolute, but they are in place to help make things more uniform and clear. A name in this code means a name that has been validly published. It may be illegitimate, but it's been validly published. And the legitimate name is the oldest legitimate name is the name that has to be adopted. It's just some others. The name of the genus with one or two epithets is termed a combination. So the combination is the genus and the species, or genus, species, and variety. A new combination at a new rank has a basionym. So if, for example, we'll cover this in a minute, but when you put an existing species in another genus, the basionym is the original publication. The name of a species, once again, is the binary combination, the binomial of the genus followed by the specific epithet. So we don't call it a specific species name, we call it the specific epithet. The epithet, the species name, can be taken from any source as long as you treat it as a Latin word. Let's see, the specific epithet can be adjectival or it can be a noun, but it has to agree. And if you don't write it out right, people are allowed to change it to where it fits the rules of Latin. And this is what changed in 2012. Publications affected by printed matter. You print the name, the description, and a type, or you can do it now in PDF document form published. For a name to be valid, it has to be effectively published. So those are the basic rules of the road. And here are the resources that are available to us, or some of the resources available to us in Florida. You can still buy this book. It is a very useful book to get online, Botanical Latin by Stern. Here's Kluhl's book. Let's see. I don't have a picture of the front cover of the manual of Flora of Florida because I included Wonderland's Flora of Florida. Here's a clever thing. This is an online version of the flora of the Southeastern United States by Weekly and his team. And of course, I use Wikipedia a lot to look at historical things. And Hammer is, I think, the best book of wildflowers. Let's go out in the field and just pick a plant that's kind of unusual, not too showy, and let's talk about its naming history so we can kind of give you a sense of what happens to a plant name over time. So when I first ran into this plant, I had never seen it before, and it's very wonderful and curious. It's a twining vine that grows in the rushes and reeds right in the salty marshes along the edge of the bay here on St. George, and actually it shows up all the way around the southeastern seaboard and into the Caribbean islands. It has opposite leaves and milky sap. Well, when I see that, I think, okay, that's only going to be 2 or 3 families that have both a milky sap and opposite leaves. The flowers show up in these starry clusters, and I'm already thinking Asclepias or Asclepias relative. But when I see the pods, I'm thinking, oh, wow. So let's look at the rest. So here's the plant twining around other herbs and rushes. There's the vine. Here it is. So you can see that there's the vine right there. I call it a leaner. There are a lot of plants in our flora, especially around the edges of the marshes, that are very weak stemmed, and they use other plants to prop themselves up. So there's that. And here's the fruit. Well, when you see that fruit, you immediately think Asclepias and the old family Asclepiadaceae, which is now Apocynaceae. If you know the plant family, if you can come to a reasonable conclusion looking at an unknown plant as to the family, you are almost home free. It saves you a lot of trouble. So I was able to go straight to Weekly's key. Working through the key, I come up with the fact that this is probably a plant now called Petalias palustri. So then I go and I look up the rap sheet on Petalias palustris. I find that the name was proposed by a guy named Fishbane, and I found that out by looking at POWO, P-O-W-O. But he's using a name that Peirce wrote. So let's look at, these are all the aliases. There's the current name for this plant, Petalias palustri. Okay. It was first named by a guy named Persoon in 1805, and he called it Sinantium angustifolium, which means narrow-leaved. Not knowing that he had named it in 1814, Peirce named it again, and this time he called it Ceropegia palustris. We'll see why that's the Bayesianism in a second. Then Asa Gray gets involved in his Synoptic Flora of North America, and he decides it really should be in this African genus, Vincetoxicum. And so he transfers Persh's name into there. So it's Persh and Asa Gray, right? Well, along comes a guy named Heller, and in a little cryptic note, he says, no, it belongs in Senenchum, and he publishes this name in 1898. Rudolf Schlechter did the treatment of Asclepiadaceae for Urban's flora of the Antilles, and he said, it belongs in the genus Metastelma. And so he made this combination. So each of these is a different name. These are combinations. Each is a different name. So this is now he said, no, Persius palustri is present in the islands and it belongs to the genus Metastelma. Well, after he published the flora in 1913, Small comes along and says, I think it needs to be in this segregate genus. It really looks so different. And the rules aren't there yet. People have not clarified. We know now that Lionia has been conserved as a genus of ericads, but Natal had published Lionia as a genus in the Asclepiadaceae. There were 4 genera of Lionia published in just a few years back in the early 1800s. And so Small goes back and says, I'm going to accept this as Lionia palustris, and he makes this combination. In 2004, a German team working with molecular data say, no, these plants belong in Funastrum. And besides that, we've gone back and we think that Pursoon's plant and Persia's plant are the same. So we're going to recognize all these plants as Funastrum angustifolium. And then Fishbane and Stevens come along and say, no, we don't think it really belongs in Funastrum. We're going to resurrect this genus Sutera and use Pursoon's name angustifolia to represent all these plants. But they were corrected very quickly by Ravel and Gandhi, who said, we tried that. We tried to conserve the name Sutera, and it was not allowed by the international committees. So you can't use the genus Sutera. And remember, Sutera having been used as a genus and now considered illegitimate, you can never use that name again. Only one time can the name of a genus, a certain word, be considered valid. So then Fishbane said, okay, well, we're going to resurrect this genus called Padalias, and we're going to we can't use angustifolium because in the genus Padalias, someone already published an earlier name, angustifolium, of a different plant. So we're going to have to now use as the basionym Ceropegia palustris. So the current name for this plant, believe it or not, is Padalias palustri, based on this basionym, even though Pursoon's name is earlier. And that's how the rules work. And I'm sorry, is that awful? Now, what about these? Well, Charles Wright in his Flora of Cuba didn't know, he thought this was a different plant, and he published it as Amphistelma solanarum. He found out very quickly that Amphistelma was an illegitimate genus name. He moved it to Metastelma, which you've seen up here. And then Elaine moved it into Senenchum. But now we've determined that these are all exactly the same as this, which is the same as that, and that's the name. So all of these aliases are called synonyms. And don't get bothered by that, because literally, if you learned a plant, I learned this plant as Senenchum palustri, and then I found it as Sutera angustifolium, and now we're calling it Padalias. The good thing is these names are still kind of good. I mean, if you know that name, you can always look it up on Plants of the World online, and you can find out what the current name is. So don't sweat all of these synonyms. I don't worry about them so much. And I use what I know the best. Let's go and look at some simpler things. So here are some native plants that have been named, were named early and have never been altered because they've been accepted all along. So Calicarpa americana was named by Linnaeus, and no one's ever challenged that. It's still called Calicarpa americana. Asclepias longifolia by Michaud has never been moved into another genus. It's never been found to be a synonym of anything. Pedicula lutea by Walter. So that was that 1788 book by Thomas Walter. Linnaeus named Clitoria Mariana. It's not been challenged. Fernald, who was the successor to Asa Gray, named Gentiana Pinelliana. And then Pedicula pumila. I have to keep moving this around, by Michaud. So that name is still good. Michaud named this, and no one's challenged any of that. But you can see more complex circumstances. Linnaeus named Linicera Marilandica, but he himself recognized that it really belonged in the genus Spigelia. So when you look at the Spigelia Marilandica, you'll see that it's L. Linnaeus and Linnaeus, because he named it originally as one plant and then he moved it into another genus. And that's how that works. The same here is true of Chamaecristi fasciculata. Michaud named it. Green moved it into the genus Chamaecristi. Michaud had called it Cassia fasciculata. Over here with Physostegia, Walter named it in the genus Prasium, but let me go back. I'm having to move this thing around. But Blake moved it into the genus Physostegia. Now we're going to move into this plant. One of my favorite plants is a plant I learned as Aster chapmanii. It was named that by Asa Gray and John Torrey in their Flora of North America. In 1841, the second volume, here's the description from that flora. A. chapmanii, and there's the description of the plant. And here they're telling us, in swamps, middle Florida, Dr. A.W. Chapman. Now, this is 1841. Remember, in 1841, Chapman would have only been 32 years old, but this plant was sent much earlier. So he collected these plants before he started writing the flora. And he was sending plants to Gray and Torrey and other people. And he's responsible for a lot more new species in Florida than just the ones he named. Now, what happened to Aster chapmanii? Well, what happened to all the asters? The decision was made in the last 30 years, that asters in North America should not be in the genus Aster. The genus Aster is a European group, and we've decided that they're not exactly the same lineage. So we've pulled them out and put them in other genera. And so now we call chapmanii, we call it Symphyotrichum, which means a symphony of hairs. That has a beautiful pappus. So that then is Torrey and Gray, and the people who did the work to move it were John Semple and Brulette. This is a page from Plants of the World Online. You can go look this up, and it's really cool. They're not the first people to try to do something. There's Aster chapmanii, Torrey and Gray. Guy Neeson out of Texas, moved it into Eurybia, okay, or Eurybia chapmanii in 1996. And earlier, Lloyd Shinners, a Texas botanist, had recognized it in the genus Heliastrum chapmanii in 1969. So the current name for it is Symphyotrichum chapmanii, described originally by Torrey and Gray, moved into the genus Symphyotrichum by Semple and Brulette. And this is the type specimen. So this is a specimen, two specimens actually, that Chapman collected and sent, must have been to Torrey because they're at New York. And Semple has gone in and said, I'm going to call this the lectotype. This is the type right here, this one plant. That's the type for the species. So if you ever have a question about what chapmanii is, this is the final resource. If it's not conspecific with this plant, it's not chapmanii. Now let's look at another set of circumstances. Here we have a wonderful springer blooming right now, Bartonia verna. It was described by Michaud, okay, and it was moved into Bartonia by Raffinesque, but printed by Barton in his Flora Virginica. So X means these people described it, but it showed up in a publication here. So Elysium parviflorum was the description and name were made by Michaud, but they showed up in a French publication. Okay. Down here, we have Calamintha coccinea. described by Natal in Hooker's Exotic Flora, and then moved by George Bentham into the genus Calaminthi. Here's the whole history of that. So the original name, Natal called it Cunila coccinea in the Exotic Flora published by Hooker. Bentham moved it into Calamintha, and now people said, well, Bentham was late to the party in 18. Or Bentham, they've decided that it's not in the genus Calamintha, that it really belongs in Kuntz's group, Clinopodium, and they've gone back and accepted Kuntz's. So that's why that's changed names. Someone has made the decision that the plant we call Calamintha coccinea really belongs in the genus Clinopodium, and has accepted the fact that a guy named Kuntz already made that combination back in 1891. I'm sorry, I know this makes your head spin. It makes my spin. Here's our Bartonia, and this is Flora virginica. So one of the things Barton did was he managed to recreate the Flora virginica because it was out of print, and update it and used Linnaean names. So Rafinesque had contributed to him the idea that this plant Verna really belonged in the genus Bartonia. It had been described as a Cinderella. And so that it was described as a Cinderella, but moved into Bartonia by Rafinesque in a publication produced by Barton. And here we have it. So Michaud called it Cinderella verna in his Flora Borealis Americana. Sprengel decided it was Andrewsia, but that was not accepted. Persoon decided it was a Centurium, and that's not accepted. So today it's in the genus Bartonia, it's Gentianaceous. And that's how you cite the authors of that. I know that's horrible. So what happens if a plant doesn't have a name and you can't find the history and you don't know anything about it? Well, how are plants authored? This is crazy. You don't have to have a license. If you learn the rules and learn the plants and get it published properly, no license is required. But there are those rules. So what do? Well, if you find a new plant, you have to determine and describe the basis for a new taxon. Like, why is it different? Why do you think it's a different species? And how do you know it's never been named? You have to designate a type, which is usually a press specimen. You have to select a unique name, and this is tough because you can see that if you select a name that was used before, that name could be invalid. So you have to select a unique name, and you have to put it in the Latin alphabet, and then you have to publish the name in the description, and it has to be validly published. And that's how a new species, botanical species, is published. So the crux of the matter is botanical names are unique and unblemished. They have to be names that no one else has a claim to. And it's not just a name, it's now a piece of terminology. It's a term for a plant that's functional, newly wrought, and symbolic. The word itself can be borrowed or contrived. You can take a native word for the plant, you can just make up a word, but it must be Latinized. It demands that the author has combed resources to ensure that the name that's going to be given to the plant is usable. And worse than that, it's subject to ongoing review. So in the future, if you publish a new species and somebody comes along and says, well, that guy was a crackpot, they can just pull it in and make it synonymous with another plant. Look at this note. So Q tells us that there have been 42,000, more than 40,000 generic names published, but only 14,000 are currently accepted. That means, however, that if you're going to propose a new genus, you have to know every one of these, because if it's ever been published, it can never be used again. And then once again, species are subject to reclassification. So let's look at a pretty little plant. Up in the forest, Apalachicola National Forest, I was paying attention to the Rexias, and I ran across this really charming plant. It's so sweet, very floriferous. It doesn't match any description. The closest thing is it might be something you could call Rexia parviflora, but a Chapman species, but it doesn't quite match that species. So is it just to figure out whether this is parviflora or something undescribed? I need to go look at the type specimen of parviflora, and I need to read the description to determine, could this be, but it doesn't match any of the pictures or photos or images that I've seen so far. So let's assume this is a new species. Well, that would be cool. What would you do? How would you name it? I'm just laying that out for you. If this were a new species, what would you do? And of course, you'd have to confirm that it is distinct from anything that's known. You would have to come up with a name that no one's ever used for Orexia. And you would have to write a description, create a press specimen or some permanent type for the species. And then you would have to properly publish it. And then defend it. Okay. So when you have a plant you don't know the name from, I put in the genus and you use the word indeterminate. We don't know what it is yet. Now, I have spoken extensively about binomials, but I know most people are more interested in common names. And I'm just going to tell you, I don't use them. I don't even know them. Even though they are useful, but they aren't authored. They're not defined. You don't know when you look at a common name where it came from or whether it really relates to the plant you're looking at. They're not unique. A plant can have two or more common names, and two different plants can have the same common name. They can change from place to place, so that we looked in China, the common name is in Chinese in there, and multiflora rose is the common name here in the US, but the scientific name, the Latin binomial, is the same in both places. My contention is that common names are no easier to learn than botanical names. People say they're so hard to learn. I'm in a world where little children walk around talking about brontosauruses and know the name of every children's toy in the world. So learning a scientific name is no big deal. Every plant does not have a common name. So if you go through the flora, you'll see plants that don't have common names and you're stuck inventing one on the spot. Common names tell you nothing about the plant. When you know a scientific name, you know what family it's in, you can look it up on the web or in books, and you have access to all that information. And a common name won't get you there. And they can be misleading, because a common name could actually sound like it can make you think a plant is of a certain type, and then you find out, no, like false rosemary. There's rosemary and then there's false rosemary. And false rosemary is not even in the mint family. It's Ceradiola, now in the Ericaceae. So common names are problematic to me personally. However, I will admit that scientific names can be misleading also. For example, a common tree for us, longleaf pine, Pinus palustris, was named as though it came from swamps. Palustris means from the swamp. But we know that most Pinus palustris are more upland, either drier land or even deep sands. So it's not a swamp tree. The same is true of a western plant, Simonsia chinensis, jojoba, jojoba. Linnaeus named it because he was under the impression that it had been collected in China, and the specimen, there was a problem with the specimen, and it was actually collected in the southwestern US. So common scientific names can be misleading. And the other problem, of course, we just saw with Patalias, with the constant change, even though the rules say that the purpose of the common name, of the scientific name, is to create stability, with recent discoveries about the origins and the evolution of different lineages of plants, the names are changing a lot. And the only sanity there is that those old names are still good. The synonyms are still good. Don't worry if you are using a name that is out of date, it still works. And that gives you an opportunity to look up and see why the change has been made and what the purpose of that is. So those are kind of my responses. So common names, yes, they're useful. I don't personally use them because they don't help me out any. And so it's always a problem. I'm out in the field with people and they're saying, is this so-and-so? Or this is so-and-so. I'm saying, well, what's the scientific name? I don't know the common names. So I probably should learn those too. But anyway, that is, I think, my whole lesson. I want to thank all the people at Florida Wildflower Foundation for having helped me out. The assistance I get from Apalachicola National Forest and all these different preserved areas. And of course, Alan Frank has taken the time to review my notes, as has David Roddenberry. The Chinese information today, I was able to get from Nick Menzies, who's the world's expert on native plants of China and the Chinese descriptions. So that's all I've got to say. Let me get out of this. How do I got to find it. Stop sharing. Okay.
All right. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and such an in-depth history of how we've come to what we currently have. Even though it's messy, it is useful. So we did have one question come through. Can you remind us what is considered a valid publication of a new taxon? So I think that referring
Okay.
to, you mentioned in
So,
2012, it was updated where it could be an online PDF.
yeah, a valid publication, but nothing before then. So the 2012 clause specifically says that that only applies from that date forward. So a valid when I was a kid, a valid publication was you would come up with a Latin name, a binomial or whatever you're doing, and a description. It was in Latin. It could be very brief. Usually you just say it's like so-and-so, but different. You could come up with a name and a description, and it had to appear in some printed matter that was widely distributed. It couldn't be like in a newspaper, though older ones were published in newspaper like Gardener's Chronicles. They were sort of like newspapers. It had to be in something that was widely distributed to institutions like libraries and colleges and universities, and it had to be something that was not considered ephemera. Today now, you can actually publish it as long as there's a PDF and as long as the publication has an ISBN. Then that will constitute, and the requirements are very simple. I mean, and a lot of kooks have gone out and published a lot of crazy names that we have to deal with, because once it's published, there it is. You have to deal with it.
Interesting. Okay. Someone asks, how does they've said that they've heard plant names could be based on their chemistry. Does that relate at all to the way plants are named today?
Well, let's say it this way. What we're talking about is the description of the species, the circumscription of what is a species can be based on its chemistry. That's different from asking, can the plant name be based? Well, you could. There are a lot of plant names that actually have given their name to chemicals. And I guess if you found a certain chemical in the plant and you knew it and it was a new plant, you could use that chemical as the name. You can use anything for a name. But based on chemistry, what they're saying is molecular biology is helping us understand how more clearly to distinguish between plants that may look similar physically. So yeah, molecular biology and chemistry help us distinguish between different plants that are different species, and therefore make it possible to understand how to apply the right name.